Hey, what's up, y'all? My name is Stevie Matt, and welcome to It's Not That Deep, and welcome back to a second round of Christmas movies. Now, in the first video, you met my buddy Bruno. He's still back there, so you can go ahead and say hi, but he was kind enough to lend his Santa hat to another friend of mine that I want you to meet today. My buddy Rufus here. What can I say? I love my teddy bears. So the movies I discussed in that first video were a bit more recent because I'm always down for, adding new Christmas movies to my rotation. But for this video, since Christmas is right around the corner now, I wanted to take it back to some of my favorite classics. So let's get into it. Gonna start this off with one of my favorite Christmas movies of all time, Scrooged, directed by Richard Donner and written by Mitch Glazer and Michael O'Donoghue. And fun fact, this movie was released the year I was born, 1988. And so this is just a fun modern take on a classic Christmas story. Well, modern to the 80s. But it's modernized in some very fun ways. So like you have the Ghost of Christmas Past is now a grimy New York taxi driver who ferries him to significant places in his past. And they of course modernize Ebenezer into a slimy television network executive named Frank Cross, which gives them the space to criticize the capitalist aspect of his character. And that's what I think I found so impressive about this movie. They're not just chastising him for being mean and grumpy, but the material aspect of his cheapness is really being called to task. So it's not just, oh, he didn't give a homeless man a couple of dollars, isn't he the worst? It's like, no, he has to be confronted later on, face to face, with that man's frozen corpse. And it's a death that he could have easily prevented with no inconvenience to himself, and he knows it, and he's forced to wrestle with that fact. And again, he's not just checked for not knowing that her husband died and the effect that it had on her son, but that because he doesn't pay her enough to afford the kind of doctors and treatment that could help him, this kid is probably going to end up institutionalized. And of course, the asylum scenario is so extreme. But that's kind of the point of it all, right? Is that he has to see the consequences of his actions in their most extreme form in order for it to maybe get through that thick-ass skull of his. But what I like is that he says there, I know the head of pediatrics at NYU who can get this kid all the help he needs. And it's like, yes, use those damn resources, you cheap bastard. So again, it's not just chastising him for being mean and grumpy and giving shitty Christmas presents, but it's like, pay your damn employees. And of course, this movie isn't perfect, right? At its core, this movie is about a man's inner growth as a person. And no story about a man's inner growth would be complete, apparently, without a female love interest whose only function to the story is to be his reward at the end of his personal journey. Especially in the 80s, child. Oof. Claire Phillips. This poor woman is written so that she waits 15 years just working at the homeless shelter and being the opposite of him in regards to charity, just waiting for him to come to his senses. She dumps him after it becomes clear to her that he's putting his career above everything else, and then she just waits. Never marries, never starts a family of her own, never finds love anywhere else, and he calls for the first time in 15 years and she just come a-running. No harm, no foul, no questions asked. And her potential future is to just become a heartless grouch like he is, embittered by his cruelty to the point where her heart shrinks down a couple sizes too small. She just has absolutely no agency of her own. Her entire character revolves around him and nothing else. And it's just really awful when you think about it. And that's just an unfortunate part of watching old movies sometimes, is that, now you're older, you're hopefully more critical. Please be more critical. And things that you hadn't seen before are now crystal clear. So yeah, this movie is it's a lot of fun. It does some things very well and does some things not so well. Simple as that. So Frank Cross, our modern day Scrooge, just hates Christmas because he's a cheap and selfish bastard. And in the next movie I'm going to talk about, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, the Grinch hates Christmas because the Who's are absolute assholes about it and they cast him out. So it was released in the year 2000, so 20 years ago. Whew. And it was directed by Ron Howard and written by Jeffrey Price and Peter S. Seaman. And it's of course based on a story by Dr. Seuss. And if I remember correctly, the Grinch originally hated Christmas because that's just who he was, and it's not until he takes everyone's presents and they still maintain their holiday joy that he realizes that the spirit of Christmas isn't in the gifts, it's in the joy and the love and the holiday cheer. Aww. But in this version, since they have to stretch out a short children's story into a full feature-length film, they do so by complicating the Grinch's relationship to the Who's so that he's not actually a villain, but a victim. It's kind of like an early precursor to Maleficent in that way, where a villain from a classic story is reframed as a victim of the people they were shown to be terrorizing in the original story. And if these are becoming a thing, I need a movie for Ursula next, because I just know King Triton's old yelling ass got some skeletons in his closet, child. I just know it. And she can only be played by Lizzo. That's my vote for Ursula. If we ever get one, Lizzo. But anyway, I digress. So while this Grinch was shown to have never really cared for Christmas, even as a kid, his hatred of it grew from the cruelty of the mayor when they were kids in school, which went unchecked and hell, even enabled by the teacher. The gift he makes for Martha May really shows that he was capable of carrying the Christmas spirit within him if it had just been properly nourished. But instead, the mayorling was a dick and ran him off. Then later, he gets invited to the Jubilation, and it takes a bit more energy this time because he's very bitter at this point. But eventually, he falls into the spirit. And then again, that bitch-ass mayor pulls a stunt and he completely regresses. And when he goes on his little tirade, what does he call out? That same hyper-consumption that had been bothering sweet little Cindy Lou Who the entire movie. And the Who's do not immediately fall into formation at the end of this movie. The mayor starts mayoring, playing those little guilt games on Cindy, an entire child. And it's not until her dad steps up and speaks up for her, reinforcing all the things that she had been saying the entire movie about, all these gifts and all this spectacle and shit, that the Who's finally fall in line. They're apparently very weak-willed and extremely impressionable, the poor things. So in the short version of the story, the Grinch has to learn that the spirit of Christmas is in cheer and family and love, etc., etc. But in this version, it's actually the Who's who have to be reminded of the meaning of the holiday. He wasn't just a Grinch to be Grinchy here, he was Grinchy because the townsfolk allowed him to be bullied and cast out, and he was rightfully angry about it. So now that I've said all that, I'd be remiss not to mention that great little gag where he dresses Max up as a reindeer and then begins directing his performance as that reindeer. So, Max just knocks off the nose because it's, probably uncomfortable and he's, a dog. But the Grinch jumps up and he's like, "Brilliant! You reject your own nose because it represents the glitter of commercialism." And it's like, okay, now Mr. Grinch, why'd you have to come for me like that? I literally built a whole platform around that kind of shit. So that felt like a direct attack on my overthinking, overanalyzing ass. But I mean, it do be like that sometimes, so I'm not gonna say he's wrong. But how dare. Jim Carrey though, man, he's really the only person who could have pulled this role off. That man acts with his entire fucking body and every muscle in his damn rubbery ass face. The things he does with his face, there were times where I legit forgot that there was a human somewhere underneath all that excellent makeup. Although I'm still not entirely convinced that he's not actually a cartoon turned into a person. Shout out to Cool World. If you know, you know. But yeah, the movie is legitimately written well, but it's Carrey's performance that drives it home. It really would not have hit the same without him. And finally, I rewatched all 3 Home Alone movies. Now, I didn't realize until about a third of the way through or so that Home Alone 3 ain't even actually a Christmas movie at all. So, oops. But I enjoyed it, so I watched it all the way through, and it's really more akin to that era of kids movies in the late 90s where it was crafty kids beating baddie adults. And I wasn't really restricted from watching R-rated movies as a kid, so I really watched everything. But when I was in a kids movie type of mood, when I was in my HBO family bag, that was the kind of movie that I was going to. So I'll probably save Home Alone 3 for a video later on with some more of those kind of movies. We'll see. So stay tuned. But the first 2 Home Alone movies are truly classics. They age just so damn well. And they literally are the same movie. Not gonna lie, but it kind of works in a weird way. The movies are just supposed to be fun and sweet. It's really not that big of a deal. And while the second one does rehash a lot of similar plot structures and beats as the first one, it's aware that it's doing it so that it really just feels like callbacks to the original. So it's the same gags, same magic, but on a bigger scale. And that's what I think you get just from having, the same director, Chris Columbus, and the same writer, John Hughes, on both films. So for example, in the first one, Kevin steals a toothbrush, then in the second one, he evolves all the way up to full-on credit card fraud. And that violent scene that he uses as distraction in both movies is now longer and more intense in the second one. And most importantly, the booby traps get so much more deadly. Like, that's the real charm of this movie, if you ask me, is that the physical comedy, you know, the physical gags are pulled right from the archives of, like, Looney Tunes and Hanna-Barbera. Because those traps that Kevin had would have straight up killed Harry and Marv in real life. Like, Kevin would have had 2 bodies on him before he even hit 10 years old. Kevin starts off in the second one by hitting Marv with not 1, not 2, not even 3, but 4 whole bricks to the face. The first one alone, from that height, if it hadn't cracked his head smooth open, would have at least given him like a severe concussion or something. I don't know. But 4? Nah, that man's brains would have been splattered all over that damn sidewalk. I'm sorry. And Harry, Kevin just straight up blows his ass up. Like, Kevin's poor uncle would have been picking up pieces of that man from his renovated house for months. Honey, what's this? Looks like brains, my dear. But none of that happens, because this ain't Final Destination, or Saw. But that does bring up an interesting question. Is Home Alone just Final Destination for kids? Could Kevin McAllister grow up to become Jigsaw? Now, what's funny is I do actually think that that could be one of his twisted futures. I think he'd be crafty enough. But I like to think that he grows up to continue being the good sweet boy that he is. Call me an optimist. Point is, though, Kevin did not come to play with you hoes. He said don't fuck with kids on Christmas, and he meant that shit. Speaking of, though, what isn't so charming about these films is that they somehow managed to demonize Kevin for standing up for himself. Both movies start off with him being antagonized by his older brother Buzz, who, first of all, his name is Buzz. In the late 80s, never trust a white boy named Buzz. Followed by him lashing out in a way that causes a big old mess of things, and then he's forced to apologize. And then you got Uncle Frank's grown ass sitting there calling Kevin a jerk. His kid calls Kevin a disease, and neither Kevin's mom or his dad or that man's wife have anything to say about it. Sir, why don't you mind your business? Worry about potty training your own child before you come outside of your neck saying anything else about anybody else's children. You handle your kids, they'll handle theirs, period. What kind of parents let that shit fly? Then it gets even worse in 2 when Buzz ruins Kevin's solo. They really buy that fake ass apology, and Kevin refuses to apologize, rightfully so. And again, Uncle Frank got some shit to say, calling this child out his name again and again. His parents ain't got shit to say about it. And guess what? Big homie Kevin had smoke for him just like he had everybody else. Read that bitch down, up, down, and sideways, baby. Bloop, bloop. And all the mama got to say to him is that what he thinks is happening is not what's actually happening. Now see, what we ain't finna do is come up to this little ass addict just to gaslight my sweet baby Kevin. You got that grown ass man and his kids downstairs calling your child everything but his name, and you gonna act like Kevin ain't sitting here making points? Okay, sis. But see, Kevin kept that foot on her neck and let her know it was tea. I know that's right. Now see, if it was just the characters, I'd be like, hey, you know, parents be like that sometimes, family be like that sometimes. But the issue is actually in the narrative. He feels bad for what he said, and he's gonna love the family no matter what they do or say, even Buzz. And so the whole narrative is wrapped up in this very toxic idea of obligatory forgiveness, that Kevin is obligated to forgive his family for what they do and say, but apparently nothing about them has to change. And that's the problem. They even gave Kevin a church redemption scene. Now, the conversation that happens in that church with the old man is actually really quite touching on its own, but like in film, typically the characters seek redemption in a church after they've done some really awful things. So like the lead in an action movie, midway through his crusade to avenge his slain wife or something, will go to a church to wrestle with his guilt over all the dead bodies he's left in his wake. But not an 8-year-old kid. Jesus. Like, okay, he called his mom a dummy, but god damn. And this is the problem. All this smoke for Kevin, who's actually a very sweet and kind and responsible and polite young boy, and none for Buzz, who, again, is named Buzz. And secondly, you just know he's the school bully, and you know he's going to grow up to become an entitled prick because he's never been told no or stop his entire life. He gets away with everything. And what's weird is that the narrative makes a concerted effort to illustrate what a sweet kid Kevin is when he's not being antagonized by his family. So like, Again, that old man in the church. He befriends the pigeon lady. That very sweet conversation with old man Duncan, and the fact that his whole thing in 2 is protecting the children's hospital donation. And there was even a scene in 2 where he asks the adults chilling around the pool if they mind him doing cannonballs into the water before he jumps in. No adult supervision, and he's still acting like that. Like, he is a good kid. He just also knows when he's been wronged, and he firmly asserts himself, as he should. And for some weird reason, the movie frames that as him being bratty and feels the need to punish him for it and nobody else. So when he says to the Christmas tree at the end of the second movie, "I know I don't deserve a good Christmas," it's like, and why not? Listen, listen, we stand Kevin McAllister in this household, okay? That's just that on that. Alright, and with that, that's all I got for you today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, go ahead and hit that like button. Feel free to drop a comment down below, but please do keep it respectful. And go ahead and hit that subscribe button while you're at it so you never miss another one. Hope you all have a wonderful Christmas, a wonderful holiday season, a wonderful rest of your week, and I'll see you in the next video.